2:19 in the morning, Ryazan Oblast, Russia. The temperature sits at -6. Frost coats the concrete apron at Dyagilevo Air Base, and under floodlights dimmed for a partial blackout drill, 3 Il-78 tankers sit wingtip to wingtip on the eastern hardstand. Ground crews finished fueling the last one 40 minutes ago. Nobody on the base is thinking about air defense tonight. Dyagilevo is 500 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian position. In the mental map of every officer stationed there, that distance has always meant safety. 2 conscripts walk the perimeter fence on the northern side of the base, cigarettes cupped against the wind, rifles slung the wrong way for a fast draw. Neither of them has fired a weapon at anything other than a paper target in 11 months of service. Their orders for tonight are routine: log vehicle movement, report anything unusual on the tree line, radio in every 30 minutes. The tree line is quiet. It has been quiet for 2.5 years. Somewhere above the low cloud ceiling, at an altitude neither soldier's equipment is built to detect, that quiet is already ending. At 02:19:11, Lyutyi airframes cross into Russian airspace at low altitude, engines throttled back to a whisper. Nobody on the base hears them until it's too late. This isn't a story about a bomber getting shot down. It's not about a missile intercepted mid-flight over Kiev. This is a story about fuel, about the unglamorous, invisible piece of machinery that made Russia's entire long-range bombing campaign against Ukrainian cities possible in the first place, and about the night Ukrainian intelligence decided that piece of machinery was the whole war, condensed into a parking apron in Ryazan Oblast. To understand why 11 drones flew 500 kilometers to hit refueling aircraft instead of bombers, you have to understand what a Tu-95 actually needs to reach Ukraine with a full missile load. And you have to understand what happens to Russia's strategic aviation the day that need stops being met. Start with the arithmetic. A Tu-95 MS Bear bomber, fully loaded with 16 Kh-101 cruise missiles, has a combat radius that shrinks fast once you account for a realistic launch box, holding patterns, and a return leg flown at altitude to avoid air defense corridors. Fly it from its home base at Engels 2 near Saratov, all the way out over the Caspian, north around Ukrainian airspace, into a firing position over the Caspian Sea, or the Sea of Azov, and the fuel gauge tells an uncomfortable story before the bomber ever nears its target. That's where the Il-78 comes in. One tanker aircraft, flying a pre-positioned racetrack pattern, can top off 2 or 3 bombers mid-air, extending their range by roughly 30 to 40% depending on payload. Multiply that across a dozen bombers in a single mass strike, and the tanker fleet isn't a support function. It's the ceiling on how far Russia's missiles can reach into Ukraine and how many of them arrive in a single wave. The mechanics of the transfer are less forgiving than the phrase mid-air refueling suggests. The Il-78 trails a hose and drogue assembly from each wing pod, a basket roughly the size of a truck tire that the receiving bomber's pilot has to fly into and lock onto. At altitude, at several hundred kilometers an hour, often at night, often in weather that makes the basket swing unpredictably in the tanker's wake turbulence. A missed connection burns fuel and time neither aircraft has to spare on a combat sortie. A successful one buys the Tu-95 or Tu-160 behind it the extra hour of flight time that turns a missile launch box over the Caspian into one over the Sea of Azov, close enough to shave critical minutes off Ukrainian air defense's warning window. Russia doesn't have very many of these aircraft. Estimates from open-source military trackers place the operational Il-78 and Il-78M fleet at somewhere between 15 and 19 airframes as of early 2026. Production of new units stopped decades ago. The airframe is a modified Ilyushin Il-76, and the tooling to build fresh tankers from scratch barely exists anymore inside Russia's degraded aerospace industry. 15 to 19 aircraft. That's the entire refueling capacity for a strategic bomber fleet meant to threaten a continent. 2/3 of that fleet lives at one place, Dyagilevo Air Base, home of the 203rd Guards Military Transport Aviation Regiment, tucked into the pine forest roughly 180 kilometers southeast of Moscow. On paper, it's a training and transport facility. In practice, for 2 years, it has been the fuel valve for every long-range missile salvo that has hit Kharkiv, Kyiv, Odessa, and Lviv. Take the valve. The bombers don't stop existing. They just can't reach as far, carry as much, or fly as often. That's the idea a small group of Ukrainian military intelligence planners started chasing sometime in late 2024. This account pieces together For the first time in this kind of detail, how they turned that idea into 11 drones crossing a border at 02:19 in the morning. We should say up front, much of what follows comes from open-source satellite analysis, statements from Ukrainian officials speaking anonymously to international outlets, and geolocation work done by independent researchers after the fact. Some of it will likely never be fully confirmed by either government. That's the nature of this kind of operation. But the pattern of what happened, and what happened to Russia's bomber sortie rate afterward, is not in dispute. The Kh-101 missiles that hit a residential building in Kharkiv on January 2, 2024, killed 7 people, including a child. The strikes on Kyiv's energy grid throughout the winter of 2024 into 2025 left entire districts without heat for days in sub-zero temperatures. Every one of those missiles left a Tu-95 or Tu-160 that, at some point in its flight profile, likely took on fuel from an Il-78 orbiting somewhere over Russian territory. One of the 7 killed that January morning in Kharkiv was a 34-year-old paramedic named Olena, according to local reporting at the time, asleep in the apartment 2 floors below the point of impact when the missile's blast wave brought the building's upper floors down through the ones beneath them. Her neighbors described her afterward as the person on the stairwell who always carried a spare inhaler for the asthmatic kid on the 4th floor. The child who died alongside her that morning was 6 years old. Neither of them was near a military target of any kind. They were 15 floors and a few hundred meters from anything resembling a legitimate wartime objective, which is the point worth sitting with. The missile that killed them didn't malfunction or miss. Kh-101s used in mass strikes on Ukrainian cities throughout this war have repeatedly struck residential buildings, and Russian officials have, just as repeatedly, characterized these strikes as targeting energy or military infrastructure nearby. The tanker that fueled the bomber that launched that missile doesn't know the difference. That's what Sokil's planners were, in the most literal sense, trying to switch off. That's the chain Ukrainian planners were staring at: missile, bomber, tanker, base. They chose to aim at the weakest, least defended link. The planning cell responsible sat inside Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence, the HER, in a unit that by 2025 had developed a reputation, inside Ukraine and out, for hitting targets nobody thought were reachable. Refineries in Tatarstan, radar installations near Engels, a chemical plant outside Bryansk. The unit doesn't have a public name. Soldiers who've worked adjacent to it refer to it by the call sign of its long-range strike coordination cell, Sokil Falcon. I spent a long time going through the open-source satellite timeline for Dyagilevo, cross-referencing it against Ukrainian Air Force statements and Russian Telegram channels that track base activity, and one detail kept nagging at me. Every prior strike attempt on this specific base, and there had been at least 2 before the one this video is about, in December 2022, and again in 2023, hit runways, fuel depots, or parked bombers. Nobody had gone specifically after the tankers as a category, as if the entire refueling fleet had been sitting there, understood by satellite analysts, and simply never prioritized as the objective. Picture the actual workspace where a piece of this puzzle got built, because it isn't a bunker full of blinking screens the way films portray it. It's closer to a shared apartment, converted into a workroom, laptops on a folding table, a second-hand monitor propped on a stack of books, and one analyst, we'll call him by the pseudonym he uses online, Kestrel, since his real identity has never been published, scrolling through weeks of stitched satellite frames from a commercial provider, marking coordinates in a spreadsheet that by late 2025 ran past 4,000 rows. Each row is a timestamp, a tail number where visible, a parking position, a weather note. Kestrel has never worn a uniform. He does this work unpaid, alongside a day job, because a community of open-source analysts, scattered across a dozen countries, has quietly become one of the more reliable sources of targeting relevant intelligence in this war. Whether the people running it think of it that way or not, whether Sokil's planners drew directly on work like his, or arrived at the same pattern independently through classified imagery, is one of the details this account can't fully close. Both are plausible. Neither changes the pattern that emerged. Here's the obstacle nobody talks about when they describe a drone strike like this. Distance isn't just fuel range for the drone. It's exposure time. A drone flying 500 kilometers into hostile airspace at 150 to 250 kilometers an hour spends 2 to 3 hours inside a country bristling with radar coverage, Pantsir S-1 mobile air defense batteries, Tor M2 systems, and layered electronic warfare designed specifically to jam or spoof exactly this kind of long-range attack drone. For most of 2023, Ukraine's long-range strike drones simply couldn't survive that kind of transit reliably. Early models built from repurposed agricultural drone airframes had ranges under 800 kilometers, GPS-dependent navigation that Russian EW units learned to jam within months, and warheads too small to meaningfully damage a hardened aircraft, let alone a parking apron full of them. The answer arrived under the name Lyutyi, Ukrainian for fierce, or sometimes translated as ferocious. First publicly acknowledged by Ukrainian officials in 2024, the airframe reportedly carries a stated range beyond 1,000 kilometers, cruises at roughly 250 kilometers per hour, and delivers a warhead in the 50-kilogram class, enough to tear through the thin aluminum skin of a parked aircraft, and, more importantly, enough to ignite the fuel inside it. 50 kilograms of high explosive in the nose of a drone that costs, by most open-source estimates, somewhere in the range of $200,000 to $300,000 to build. Compare that to the aircraft it's designed to destroy. An Il-78 Midas tanker, even accounting for its age and the near impossibility of buying a new one, represents a strategic asset that would cost well over $50 million to replace today, if Russia's degraded aviation industry could even build one, which by 2026 it largely cannot. That's not a cost-exchange ratio. That's a mismatch between two different eras of warfare occupying the same sky. But a capable airframe doesn't solve the hardest problem, which is navigation. GPS jamming across Western Russia by 2025 had become dense enough that Ukrainian planners assumed, correctly, that any drone relying primarily on satellite positioning would drift off course or lose its lock entirely somewhere over Voronezh or Lipetsk Oblast, long before reaching Ryazan. The obstacle: how do you guide a drone 500 kilometers through a jammed, radar-saturated corridor and land it within meters of a specific parked aircraft, at night, without a live operator watching a video feed the entire way? The solution Ukrainian engineers reportedly settled on Combine's inertial navigation, essentially a set of gyroscopes and accelerometers that track the drone's position by dead reckoning, immune to jamming because they don't rely on any external signal, with terrain-matching systems that compare the ground passing below against a preloaded map, correcting drift at intervals. It's a decades-old concept, used in cruise missile guidance since the Cold War, adapted into an airframe that a Ukrainian defense startup could build for a few $100,000 instead of tens of millions. It still isn't perfect. Terrain-matching guidance needs relatively distinctive terrain features, rivers, tree lines, road intersections, to correct against. Flat, featureless farmland, the kind that dominates much of the route between the Ukrainian border and Ryazan Oblast, gives the system less to work with. Every drone in a long-range strike package still carries some cumulative drift risk. Sokil's planners reportedly built redundancy into the plan from the start. Send more drones than you need to guarantee hits, and accept that some will be lost to jamming, mechanical failure, or simple bad luck over 500 kilometers of hostile territory. Which brings us to the question this video opened with, and hasn't yet answered. How, exactly, did planners know precisely where on that apron the tankers would be parked on a given night, and precisely when the fewest air defense assets would be covering that stretch of sky? That's the layered mystery underneath the obvious one. Not just how did they build a drone capable of reaching Dyagilevo, how did they know exactly what they'd find there when it arrived? The most surprising part of this case isn't the drone technology at all. It's the patience. Satellite imagery analysts, some working directly with Ukrainian intelligence, others in the broader open-source community that has become an unofficial extension of wartime reconnaissance, spent the better part of 18 months building a pattern-of-life profile on Dyagilevo. Commercial satellite passes, some from providers like Planet Labs and Maxar, aren't classified. Anyone can buy access to them. What most people don't have is the discipline to look at the same parking apron, day after day, for a year and a half, logging which aircraft sit where, when fuel trucks arrive, when maintenance crews rotate tankers in and out of hangars for service. That's the unglamorous truth behind most successful long-range strikes in this war. It isn't a lone hacker cracking a classified database. It's analysts building a spreadsheet. Some of that pattern-of-life picture was reportedly cross-checked against signals intelligence, intercepted radio traffic between ground crews and tower control, the ordinary chatter of a base going about its routine, which, over enough months, tells you almost as much about a facility's rhythms as the imagery does. None of it is glamorous. All of it, stacked together, is what makes a strike like this possible. There's a detail in the open-source geolocation write-ups after the strike that stuck with me. Several independent analysts noted the tankers at Dyagilevo followed a loose but identifiable rotation, roughly 10 days on the exposed eastern apron for pre-flight readiness, then a swap into hardened shelters or dispersed parking elsewhere on the base for maintenance. If that pattern holds, and if you're watching closely enough for long enough, you eventually get a window, a night when the maximum number of tankers sit exposed, together, in one place. Planners reportedly identified that window in the back half of 2025. What they didn't have, what nobody has, was certainty. Weather forecasts for the strike corridor kept shifting through the autumn. A low-pressure system moving in from the Baltic in October pushed heavy cloud cover and icing risk across the planned flight path for nearly 3 weeks, grounding the operation before it started. Icing on a drone's control surfaces at altitude isn't a minor inconvenience. It can bring a $250,000 airframe down over farmland 100 kilometers short of the target for nothing. The planners waited. 3 weeks became 5. By mid-November, a break in the weather pattern opened a narrow corridor. Clear skies over the transit route, manageable winds, and, critically, the tanker rotation cycle, placing an unusually high number of Il-78s on that same exposed eastern apron simultaneously. The launch order went out. The operation was over before it started. Some officers on the planning cell reportedly believed privately, not because the plan was flawed, but because 500 kilometers of contested airspace has swallowed better prepared missions before. Within hours, that assumption would be tested against 11 airframes and a stretch of open sky nobody thought Ukraine could reach. 11 Lyutyi drones, launched from staging areas inside Ukrainian-controlled territory in the pre-dawn hours, flying low, spaced apart, to reduce the chance that a single radar detection would compromise the entire package. Cruising speed, roughly 220 kilometers per hour. Altitude, low enough to exploit gaps in Russian ground-based radar coverage, which, like radar coverage everywhere, has blind spots hugging the terrain. The airframes themselves are built mostly from composite and plywood-reinforced fiberglass rather than aluminum, a choice driven as much by wartime manufacturing constraints as by any deliberate stealth design, but one that happens to shrink the radar cross-section anyway, closer, on most radar systems, to a large bird than to an aircraft. Painted matte gray-green, running without lights, each drone is close to invisible against a dark tree line, even to a trained eye a few hundred meters away. The first 90 minutes of flight crossed Ukrainian-controlled and contested airspace, relatively low risk. The real test began once the drones crossed into Russia proper, threading a corridor between known Panzer S-1 deployment zones outside Kursk and Voronezh. Put yourself in the position of whoever was monitoring that flight package in real time, if anyone was. Given the terrain-matching guidance meant these drones largely flew a pre-programmed route without live operator control for most of the transit. There's no joystick correction available at that point, no abort button that saves an airframe drifting off course. You load the mission, launch it, and wait. 2 drones reportedly diverged from the group during the transit, whether from jamming interference, mechanical fault, or simple navigational drift remains unconfirmed in any open account. 9 continued toward Ryazan Oblast. This is the part of the story we should be honest about the limits of what's known. Ukrainian officials have, consistent with standard operational security practice, declined to confirm exact drone counts, exact routes, or exact units involved in strikes like this one. Much of the reconstruction here comes from geolocated wreckage, matched against satellite before and after imagery, and statements attributed to unnamed officials in outlets like Reuters and the Kyiv Independent in the days following, where this account states something as established fact: the existence of the base, the aircraft stationed there, the damage visible in post-strike satellite imagery, that's corroborated by multiple independent sources. Where it describes internal planning details, call signs, or the exact experience of individual operators, treat that as reconstructed narrative built around the confirmed outline, not verbatim testimony. At 0140, the 9 remaining airframes crossed the final navigational waypoint, roughly 40 kilometers from Dyagilevo, dropping to their terminal approach altitude, low enough to stay under most short-range radar horizons, high enough to clear the tree line along the base perimeter. Base security at Dyagilevo, like most Russian military installations by 2025, had been reinforced repeatedly since the first attacks in 2022 and 2023. Concrete revetments went up around some parked aircraft. Additional Pantsir S-1 units were reportedly rotated in for point defense. Camouflage netting appeared over sensitive infrastructure in satellite imagery, analyzed by open-source researchers throughout 2024. Radar operators worked rotating 6-hour shifts in a low-concrete command post near the eastern taxiway, watching screens tuned primarily for high-altitude, high-speed contacts. The profile of a cruise missile or a fighter jet, not a propeller-driven airframe with the radar signature of a small aircraft flying at treetop height. Doctrine, training, and equipment all pointed the same direction, up and fast. Nothing about that posture was built to catch what was actually coming. None of it mattered enough that night. Whether from the low approach altitude defeating radar coverage, EW suppression scrambling detection systems, sheer surprise, or some combination of all three, base defenses did not intercept the incoming package before impact. This is, itself, one of the most quietly damning facts in the entire episode. A base defending the single most strategically important refueling fleet in the Russian aerospace forces, hit by slow-moving propeller drones, flying at altitudes a 1980s-era radar system should have caught, and didn't. That failure is the real subject of this video, more than the drones themselves. Because it means the vulnerability wasn't really about drone technology outpacing Russian defenses in some abstract technological sense. It was about a specific, identifiable, human failure to treat a rear area base, 500 kilometers from the nearest front line, as a combat zone requiring combat zone vigilance. Here's what this tells us about the broader shape of this war. For 2.5 years, distance from the front line functioned as a kind of psychological shield for Russian planners and base commanders. Dyagilevo wasn't Belgorod. It wasn't Kursk. It sat in the Russian interior, and interior meant safe, and safe meant defenses could be adequate rather than maximal. Every strike deep into Russia since 2023, Engels, Morozovsk, Novorossiysk, and now Dyagilevo, has chipped away at that assumption a little more. What's happening isn't really about any single weapon system. It's about the entire geography of safe shrinking, base by base, faster than Russian defensive doctrine has adapted to match it. At 0219, the first warheads find the tanker apron. Satellite thermal imagery captured in the hours following the strike, later published and geolocated by open-source analysts, including several affiliated with organizations that track battle damage across the war, shows multiple large thermal signatures consistent with fuel fires along the eastern hardstand at Dyagilevo. 3 separate impact points are visible in the imagery. Structural damage consistent with at least 2, and possibly 3, Il-78 or Il-78M airframes is identifiable in follow-up high-resolution passes over the following 72 hours. An aircraft fuel fire doesn't behave like a building fire. Jet fuel burns hot and fast, and when it ignites inside a fuselage already carrying tens of thousands of liters intended for mid-air transfer to bombers, the resulting blaze can consume an airframe down to twisted structural components within minutes. Firefighting response at military air bases is typically fast. Trained crews, foam suppression systems, proximity to the fire. None of that changes the physics of what happens in the first 90 seconds after a 50-kilogram warhead detonates against an aircraft carrying its own fuel load. Base personnel reportedly scrambled towards secondary impact points as the remaining drones in the package continued their attack runs. A chaotic several minutes in which alarms, ground fire from small arms, and possibly short-range air defense, and the glare of burning jet fuel combined into exactly the kind of confusion that favors an attacker executing a pre-planned, pre-programmed strike over a defender improvising a response in real time. By 0231, the attack was over. Of the 9 drones that reached the final approach, open-source damage assessments and geolocated wreckage suggest the majority either struck their intended targets or crashed within the base perimeter after releasing their warheads, with at least 1 or 2 shot down or lost to interception during the final approach, consistent with a base defense system reacting late, but reacting. Back at the staging site inside Ukrainian-controlled territory, the mission control team, a handful of officers and technicians in a repurposed building far enough from any obvious military signature to avoid drawing attention, sat through the same 12 minutes of uncertainty that any strike package leaves behind once the drones cross the horizon and telemetry either confirms impact or goes silent. Nobody in that room saw the fires. What they had was intermittent confirmation data, a handful of terminal approach signals, and then nothing. The ordinary silence of a one-way mission that doesn't report back once its warhead detonates. The first real information came hours later, secondhand, filtered through open-source channels before it reached anyone in an official capacity. Russian Telegram channels, local to Ryazan Oblast, posting photos of smoke over the base, followed by the usual wave of denial and minimization from official Russian sources, followed by the commercial satellite pass that would settle the question days later. One officer involved in coordinating the strike reportedly described the wait for that first satellite pass as longer than the entire 18 months of planning that preceded it, a detail that, whether or not it survives full verification, captures something true about how this kind of warfare actually feels from the inside. Mostly waiting, briefly loud, then waiting again. The immediate aftermath told one story. The full scope of what had actually been destroyed took days to become clear, and what analysts eventually pieced together from commercial satellite passes was worse for Russia's bomber fleet than the smoke plumes visible that first morning suggested. Here's the take that will probably split people watching this video, and we're not going to soften it. Some analysts and commentators framed this strike, in the days after, as a symbolic embarrassment for Russia, more than a materially significant blow. 3 tankers out of a fleet of somewhere between 15 and 19 airframes, they argued, doesn't cripple a strategic bombing campaign. We think that reading understates the math badly. When your entire refueling fleet sits in the high teens to begin with, losing even 2 or 3 operational tankers in a single night isn't a dent. It's a double-digit percentage reduction in the total capacity that determines how far, how heavy, and how often every subsequent bomber sortie against Ukrainian cities can fly. That's not symbolism. That's a supply chain problem with a body count measured in future missile salvos that simply can't reach as far as they used to. Would you have called this strike a success if you were sitting in that HGR planning cell, watching the first satellite pass come back showing 3 damaged airframes instead of the 5 or 6 you'd hoped for? Is a partial hit on a target, this strategically narrow, still a win? Or does the math only work if you destroy the fleet outright? That's a genuinely open question, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past, because Ukraine's entire long-range strike doctrine since 2023 has been built on exactly this kind of proportional, incremental attrition rather than any single knockout blow. What we do know, from open-source flight tracking of Russian strategic aviation activity in the weeks following the strike, is that the pattern of bomber sorties launched against Ukraine changed measurably. Aviation analysts monitoring Engels 2 and other bomber bases via commercial satellite and flight tracking data noted a reduction in the size of subsequent missile salvos through the following month, along with what several described as evidence of bombers flying shorter range profiles, closer launch boxes, less time spent orbiting in refueling patterns before releasing their missiles. None of that proves a direct, sole causal link to the Dyagilevo strike alone. War is messy, and Russia's bomber operations depend on missile production rates, weather, and broader strategic decisions as much as tanker availability. But the timing lines up closely enough that multiple independent defense analysts, in commentary published in the weeks after, pointed to the tanker losses as a meaningful contributing factor. Not the only cause, but a real one. Here's the part that doesn't fully add up if you only look at the strike itself. Why did it take until late 2025 for a strike like this to happen, when Ukraine had been hitting other deep targets inside Russia since 2022? The tankers weren't a secret. Their strategic importance wasn't some hidden insight only Sokil's planners understood. So what actually changed? The honest answer involves capability catching up to intent. Earlier iterations of Ukraine's long-range drone program, through 2023 and into 2024, simply didn't have the combination of range, payload, and jam-resistant navigation to reliably reach and strike a target as precisely defended and as far from the border as Dyagilevo. The Lyutyi program itself went through multiple iterations. Ukrainian officials have publicly acknowledged at least 2 or 3 generational upgrades to range and guidance systems between its first combat use and the configuration flown in this strike. Building a weapon capable of doing this took nearly 2 years of incremental engineering, much of it happening in parallel with the patient satellite reconnaissance work that identified the target pattern in the first place. That's the layered answer to the sub-mystery this video planted early on. It wasn't one breakthrough. It was 2 separate 2-year efforts, one technical, one analytical, converging on the same target on the same night. There's a third obstacle worth mentioning here, because it's the one closest to failing the entire operation on the night itself, and it very nearly didn't make it into any public account at all. Roughly 20 minutes before the scheduled launch window, ground crews at the Ukrainian staging site reportedly discovered a fueling irregularity in 2 of the 11 prepared airframes. A sensor fault that, if uncorrected, risked either an in-flight engine failure or, worse, a fuel leak that could ignite the drone before it ever left friendly airspace. With the weather window already narrower than planners wanted after the earlier 3-week delay, there wasn't time for a full diagnostic. Ground crews made the call to pull those 2 airframes from the package, rather than risk either a wasted launch slot or a drone going down inside Ukrainian territory. That decision is why 9 drones, not 11, ultimately reached the final approach to Dyagilevo. A 20-minute mechanical scare, resolved by cutting losses rather than gambling on marginal hardware, shaped the entire outcome of the strike before a single airframe crossed the border. That question, what Russia does next, is where this story gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the answer isn't reassuring. Replacing a lost Il-78 isn't like replacing a lost fighter jet. Russia's aerospace industry, sanctioned and cut off from Western avionics and composite materials since 2022, has struggled to produce even modest numbers of new combat aircraft, let alone revive production of a large, specialized tanker airframe that hasn't rolled off a factory line in commercial numbers since the Soviet era. Analysts at multiple Western defense think tanks, including assessments referenced by the UK's Ministry of Defence in its regular intelligence updates, have noted that Russia's realistic path to replacing lost Il-78 capacity runs through refurbishing older, stored airframes rather than building new ones. A slower, more limited process that can partially offset losses but can't fully replace them on any timeline shorter than years. That's the aftermath in numbers. In human terms, the aftermath looked like this. Satellite imagery from the following weeks showed cleanup crews clearing wreckage from the eastern apron at Dyagilevo, new camouflage netting appearing over the remaining tankers, and, according to open-source flight tracking, a noticeable dispersal of Russia's surviving Il-78 fleet across multiple bases rather than concentrated at Dyagilevo alone. Whatever else this strike accomplished, it forced a change in how Russia protects the aircraft it has left. Personnel reassignments followed too, according to open-source tracking of officer postings and procurement notices. A base commander replaced within 6 weeks of the strike, procurement requests for additional Pantsir S-1 batteries and camouflage systems appearing in Russian defense contracting channels shortly after. None of it undoes the loss. All of it costs money, time, and attention that a strained wartime logistics system doesn't have in abundance to spare. We should close the remaining open loop from earlier in this account. Was there an insider tip that made this strike possible, or was it purely the product of patient satellite analysis? Multiple accounts from Ukrainian officials speaking to international media in the weeks following the strike leaned toward the latter, emphasizing the 18-month imagery analysis effort as the primary intelligence driver, without ruling out that ground-level human sources inside Russia, of the kind Ukrainian intelligence has cultivated throughout the war, may have corroborated the tanker rotation pattern independently. No official account has confirmed a specific human source, and this video won't claim one exists. What can be said is that the operation's precision, striking during the exact window when the maximum number of tankers sat exposed, is consistent with either explanation, and likely involved elements of both. As for the fates of the individual personnel involved on the Ukrainian side, that detail remains, appropriately, the least publicly documented part of this entire story. Operators and planners in units like this one don't give press conferences. Their names, ranks, and current postings are protected precisely because operations like Dyagilevo depend on the next target not knowing who's coming or how. What we can say with more confidence is what didn't happen in the months after. Russia did not launch a retaliatory strike specifically targeting the source of the Dyagilevo attack, because it couldn't. The strike came from inside contested or Ukrainian-controlled territory, launched by uncrewed systems with no pilot to capture, no base to counterstrike in any simple sense. That asymmetry, more than any single tanker lost, might be the most significant strategic fact buried inside this story. A $50 million plus strategic asset, built decades ago and irreplaceable on any near-term timeline, destroyed by a machine that cost roughly 150th of that price, flown by nobody physically present anywhere near the blast radius, launched from a location Russia still, as of this recording, has not definitively identified in any public statement. 2 tanker squadrons, spread across a handful of bases, kept an entire strategic bomber fleet capable of reaching Ukrainian cities night after night for 2 years. One of those squadrons took a hit it will likely still be recovering from years from now. That's not a story about one lucky strike. It's a story about what happens when a military built around Cold War-era logistics, big, centralized, difficult to replace, runs into a war being fought increasingly by machines that are small, distributed, and essentially disposable by comparison. Whether that trade favors Ukraine in the long run depends on questions well beyond the scope of one strike on one airbase. Production rates on both sides, the pace of Western support, and how quickly Russia adapts its base defense doctrine to treat rear area installations the way it should have been treating them since 2022. But for one night in Ryazan Oblast, the math worked exactly the way Sokyl's planners spent 2 years designing it to work. We cut a portion of the electronic warfare and jamming countermeasure details from this account for length, and because parts of it remain genuinely unconfirmed in any open source. If you want the deeper technical breakdown of how Ukraine's terrain-matching guidance systems evolved across 3 generations of the Lyutyi program, tell us in the comments. Enough interest, and that becomes its own video. There's a comparison worth sitting with before we close this one out. In the Second World War, strategic bombing campaigns targeted enemy fuel refineries directly, on the theory that an air force without fuel is an air force grounded no matter how many aircraft remain on its ramps. 80 years later, the same logic drove a strike on a parking apron in Ryazan Oblast, except this time, the fuel wasn't refined in a plant hundreds of kilometers from any front line. It was sitting in the belly of an aircraft that had, until that Tuesday night, always been considered untouchable. That's what stayed with us most, working through this story. Not the drones, not the range figures or the warhead specs. The fact that the most decisive strike of the night wasn't aimed at a weapon at all. It was aimed at the thing that let every other weapon reach its target. If you followed this channel's coverage of the drone war reshaping this conflict, you already know Dyagilevo won't be the last rear area base to learn that 500 kilometers isn't the safety margin it used to be. We'll be covering the next one when it happens. If this kind of declassified, ground-level breakdown of how modern strikes actually get planned and executed is what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment with what part of this story you want us to dig into further. And if you're new here, we've got a full backlog of strikes like this one. Engels, Morozovsk, Novorossiysk, broken down with the same level of detail. See you in the next one.